Who was Max Weber?
Max Weber, 1864 to 1920, held chairs at the universities at Freiburg, Heidelberg, and Munich. Although what biographers refer to as a nervous ailment curtailed his career as an academic. His main project was to understand the dominant features of modern life in its Western development. His most famous work was The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, 1904.
How was Plotinus' system of thought expressed in the Enneads?
Plotinus, 205 to 270, system of thought was arranged in the Enneads, which was made up of 6 groups of 9 essays. The first 3 groups are about the physical world and human interaction with it. The 4th group is about the soul, the 5th is about intelligence, and the 6th is about the One. Although Plotinus thought he was a faithful student of Plato, he in fact added ideas from Aristotle, the Stoics, and his own philosophical imagination. Plotinus divided the Platonic imperceptible world of forms into 3 parts: the One, intelligence, and the soul. The One is above everything that is, because it is the highest principle of being and causation. As a principle, however, the One is everything, in everything. Because the One is a unity, it has no thought or awareness, which requires a separation between thinking and the object thought. Paradoxically, the One is both completely ignorant, lacking awareness even of itself, but also, in its own way, aware of everything that it has created. After the One, there is intelligence, which corresponds to Plato's specific forms, taken as a totality. Intelligence has an idea for everything that exists. Intelligence also contains number, which corresponds to souls, and it contains original matter. However, there is not an endless multiplication of ideas because, as the Stoics proclaimed, every so often the entire world is destroyed.
Who was Al-Ghazali?
Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, 1058 to 1111, was a philosopher, theologian, jurist, and Sufi mystic. Born in the Middle Eastern region of Khorasan, or Khorasan, and educated in the intellectual center of Nishr, he became head of Nizamiyat, a seminary in Baghdad, where his teachings in law and theology were renowned. He sought certainty in knowledge, and when he could not find it in his academic studies, he resigned his academic post, left his family, and became a Sufi mystic. He wandered for a decade and, as the result of those experiences, returned to Nishapur to resume teaching. Al-Ghazali came to believe that truth can be found only as the result of God's grace. In Deliverance from Error, his spiritual autobiography, he related his futile quest for truth and certainty through both Islamic and Western intellectual traditions and concluded that sensory information and reason were just as lacking. His alternative to rational and sensory knowledge was a light which God Most High cast into my breast. The key to most knowledge. His attack on philosophical authorities as a guide to truth and certainty. Particularly in the writings of Avicenna, 980-1037, culminated in the intentions of the philosophers. And in the incoherence of the philosophers he offered a detailed intellectual attack on the views of Plato and Aristotle, which was again directed against Avicenna.
What was William Whewell's fundamental antithesis of knowledge?
Whewell claimed that in every act of knowledge, there are two opposite elements, which we may call ideas and perceptions. Whewell was influenced by Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, and shared Kant's belief that scientific information is not a pure collection of objective facts in the world, but that a prior system of ideas is required to arrive at scientific knowledge. However, he did not go as far as Kant in locating the possibility for scientific knowledge wholly within the mind. That is, unlike Kant, Whewell thought that the world as it is known to human beings exists independently of human minds. Neither did Whewell go as far as the empiricists, who emphasized induction and observation, in what he called the sensationalistic school.
Who was Arete of Cyrene?
Arete of Cyrene, c. 400 c. 340 BCE, the daughter of Aristippus, a friend and student of Socrates, who was present at his death, succeeded her father as head of the Cyrenaic school. She taught ethics in the hedonistic tradition and natural philosophy, for 30 years.
Who was Drive? Pangloss?
The brilliant French satiric essayist François-Marie Arouet de Voltaire, 1694–1778, pilloried Leibniz's philosophical optimism with the character of Dr. Pangloss in his novel Candide. The character Candide is the illegitimate nephew of a baron who starts out life in luxury, with Dr. Pangloss as his teacher. Pan is Greek for all and gloss means tongue, speech, and words, so that Dr. Pangloss translates as Dr. Altok. Dr. Pangloss teaches the metaphysico-theologo-cosmology to Candide. This teaching is a caricature of Leibniz and the poet Alexander Pope's philosophical optimism, which Voltaire found very difficult to reconcile with real human suffering, such as the devastation caused by the 1755 Lisbon earthquake and the oppression of the Ancien regime in pre-revolutionary France. The view of philosophical optimism held that because God is good, Everything in the world must be good, as well. It is, in fact, the best world it could be, and everything in it, including what appear as evil to us, is, in the grand scheme of things, inevitable and for the best. Here's a sample of Voltaire's satire in which Dr. Pangloss expresses his belief. It is demonstrable, said he, that things cannot be otherwise than as they are. For as all things have been created for some end, they must necessarily be created for the best end. Observe, for instance, the nose is formed for spectacles, therefore we wear spectacles. The legs are visibly designed for stockings, accordingly we wear stockings. Stones were made to be hewn and to construct castles, therefore my lord has a magnificent castle. For the greatest baron in the province ought to be the best lodged. Swine were intended to be eaten, therefore we eat pork all the year round, and they who assert that everything is right, do not express themselves correctly. They should say that everything is best.
What was in Saint Isidore's encyclopedia?
Saint Isidore of Seville's, c. 560-636, Encyclopedia the Etymologia was an ambitious attempt to compile all the knowledge of its day in one source. It contained everything that was known and believed at the time, with little critical editing. For example, under A was an entry on the atomic theory, but there was also an entry on the mythical antipodes, who were said to populate rocky plains in the south of Africa. Isidore related that their big toes were not on the inside of their feet, but on the outside, which afforded them greater agility in navigating their rocky terrain.
How did Ralph Waldo Emerson define transcendentalism?
He considered transcendentalism a kind of philosophical idealism that held that the ultimate reality was spiritual and not material. He thought that experience was limited in telling us what things are in themselves or what to value. Emerson also referred to a Kantian notion of ideas or imperative forms, which made experience possible, and he ascribed to Immanuel Kant (1724–1804) the label transcendental forms, for these realities of the mind and spirit.
Why is philosophy important?
Philosophical study of the natural world gave rise to the physical sciences of our day. Physics, astronomy, geology, biology, and chemistry. Although other cultures, for example, China, have had distinctive sciences and technology, Western technology, as a product of Western science, has had global predominance in the modern period. Philosophical study of the human world gave rise to the social sciences of psychology, history, political science, sociology, and anthropology, as well as linguistics and cognitive science. Of course, many theoretical ideas about the world remain in philosophy as metaphysics. And many human questions are still only considered in philosophy, insofar as it is part of the humanities. These human questions are of universal interest across cultures and in ordinary, practical, daily life.
What kinds of jobs do philosophers have?
Since about 1940, most professional philosophers have been employed as teachers in colleges and universities. They also advance the discipline of philosophy by publishing books and articles.
Who was Mary Wollstonecraft?
Mary Wollstonecraft, 1759 to 1797, is considered the founder of modern feminism in the West. She wrote at the time of the French Revolution and contributed to democratic ideas, generally, in vindication of the rights of men, as well as to arguments for the equality of women in vindication of the rights of women. She also wrote novels, an autobiographical travel essay, and shorter works on education.
What was Immanuel Kant's Copernican revolution?
Just as Copernicus changed the center of our universe from Earth to Sun, Kant relocated the basic principles and categories of reality, as studied by science, from the external world to the mind. Like John Locke, 1632 to 1704, he began with an examination of the powers of the mind, and an aim to reject metaphysical claims that could not be rationally justified. He posited a human rational necessity to understand real experience in space and time and a practical need to live with other rational beings, seeking the principles that could fulfill those requirements. In 1770 Kant argued in On the Form and Principles of the Sensible and Intelligible World that our knowledge of space and time is only about appearances, but that we are still justified in making limited claims about what lies behind those appearances. This was the foundation for what became known as critical philosophy. Kant's revolutionary claim was that we have a priori knowledge of both space and time. Because they are the forms of our perception, space is the organization of experience in the outer world, while time is the organization of experience in the inner world. This was followed by the two editions of his Critique of Pure Reason, with his prolegomena to any future metaphysics published in between to respond to criticism.
Who was Alain Locke?
Alain Leroy Locke, 1885 to 1954, was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar. He wrote a dissertation in philosophy at Harvard University in 1918, but was told that he would not be hired to teach philosophy, except at a black institution. Locke's dissertation was the problem of classification in the theory of value. Ralph Barton Perry, 1876 to 1957, was his advisor. In 1921 Locke returned to Howard University, where he had previously taught English. To chair the philosophy department, he held that position until 1953. Locke has been primarily remembered for his work in the creation and support of the Harlem Renaissance, and for his writings on black art and music. However, he also developed his studies in pragmatism and applied them to issues of racism and racial identity in complex ways that were only first recovered in the late 20th century. Locke's principal pragmatic philosophical work was When Peoples Meet. A Study in Race and Culture Contacts, 1942. Locke's other philosophical writings have since been edited and reinterpreted by Leonard Harris, 1948, and others.
What did Parmenides and his Eleatic school believe?
Parmenides of Elea, c. 515 to 450 BCE, together with his two pupils, Zeno, c. 490 430 BCE, and Melissus of Samos. Fluid 440 BCE, formed the Eleatic school. Parmenides had the compelling idea of uniting the ultimate primary substance of everything with our perceived reality that seems to be composed of many different things. He argued forcefully that reality is an undifferentiated whole that is unmoving and unchanging. Parmenides dismissed change and the many different things that human beings ordinarily experience as mere appearance and illusion.
How did Descartes solve his evil demon hypothesis?
René Descartes recounted everything that he could doubt: sensory information, the external world, his own thought processes, and the goodness of God, and noted that one thing he could not doubt was that he himself was doing the doubting. From this he concluded that he could not doubt that he existed, since someone or something must be doing the doubting. He wrote later about his famous cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. I noticed that while I was trying to think everything false, it must needs be that I, who was thinking this, was something. And observing that this truth, I am thinking, therefore I exist, was so solid and secure that the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics could not overthrow it. I judged that I need not scruple to accept it as the first principle of the philosophy that I was seeking.
What are John Stuart Mill's progressive ideas in the subjection of women?
Mill begins the subjection of women 1869, by saying that it is more difficult to argue against a position that is held on irrational grounds than one based on reasoning. René Descartes 1596–1650 made a similar claim at the beginning of his Meditations. Those who hold irrational views will not be persuaded to change them by rational argument but will just look for a more profound basis of their opinion, even to the point of claiming it is the result of instinct. This set the stage for Mill's claim that the condition of women at the time he wrote was the result of a long historical tradition of might makes right, combined with the power enjoyed by all men simply by being born male. He compared this condition to slavery on a number of counts. Women were completely dependent on men for their livelihood, being deprived of education and means for productive employment. Women did not have control over their own bodies or children in marriage. Women lacked civil rights, such as the right to vote or own property. And women were subject to violence and rape within marriage, without legal recourse. Mill also claimed that women were trained to display the traits of mind and character, or lack thereof, that would make them desirable subordinates to men. Stupidity, preoccupation with appearance, and adoration of and submission to men. Men assumed that all women wanted to be wives and mothers, which made their exclusion of them from education and the professions ironic, to say the least. But although marriage appeared to be a contractual relationship, women did not have any real freedom to withhold their consent because they could not earn a living on their own. Against existing arguments that women were not the equals of men, Mill claimed that insofar as women had been so suppressed by their circumstances in marriage and lack of education, men knew very little about what their true capabilities were. He claimed that the highest masculine and the highest feminine characters were clearly equal.
Why was the single status of early modern men of science and philosophy important?
Inevitably, bachelorhood would have had the negative effect of not having long-term, intimate relationships or much experience with children and family life in adulthood. A bachelor's style of life would have then supported a view of the world from the perspective of a lone individual, and an assumption that the philosophical mind would always have the same gender as oneself.
What was Robert Boyle's atomic theory?
Boyle, 1627–1691, claimed that the things in the world studied in physics, chemistry, biology, and inquiries into gases and fluids were all made up of atoms. He thought that because atoms could be used to explain and predict what was observable, their existence was an empirical matter and not the results of pure speculation. Unlike Gassendi, who was content to suspend judgment on whether atoms existed, Boyle claimed that atoms did exist, using the method of transdiction.
Was Michel Foucault an existentialist?
Foucault's philosophy was mainly social criticism rather than the theory of self-creation associated with existentialism. However, in his own life, he became notorious for unconventional and spontaneous behavior in ways that the public has associated with existentialism. During the last years of his life, Foucault was active in the world in ways that some found shocking, both politically and personally. In a late interview he said, "Well, do you think I have worked all these years to say the same thing and not be changed?" Foucault first visited the United States in 1970 to lecture at the University at Buffalo, State University of New York, later visiting the University of California, Berkeley. He took LSD at Zabriskie Point in Death Valley National Park, and referred to the experience as life-changing in positive ways. In the late 1950s, he went to Iran, and after the revolution he supported the new reactionary government. His essays about Iran, published in the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, provoked controversy when they were translated into French and English in 1994 and 2005, respectively. Foucault was in a committed 25-year relationship with Daniel Deford, a former student. He described it as having lived in a state of passion, adding that at some moments this passion has taken the form of love. Much has been said and written about Foucault's exploration of homosexual bars and sex clubs in the Castro district of San Francisco. Foucault died of an AIDS-related infection. Although this was not admitted at first, when his death was announced in Le Monde. Before he died, Foucault destroyed massive amounts of his unpublished writings and directed that other manuscripts be destroyed also.
What was Vico's new view of history as knowledge?
Unlike the Cartesians, who dismissed history as a hodgepodge of fiction and unconnected facts, Vico thought that the historian can achieve more certainty than the scientist because he is studying the story of a world made by humans. He disagreed with Hugo Grotius, 1583–1645, Thomas Hobbes, 1588–1679, and others, who began with the idea of a state of nature or some other way of positing a static, unchanging human nature. He was wary of what we would call anachronism, or assuming that words had the same meanings in the past as they do now, or that people have always thought the same way. Vico believed that historical events change human ideas. Vico asserted that every theory must start from the point where the matter of which it treats first began to take shape. According to Vico, the way the historian can discover the minds and feelings of those in past times is to decode their language, myths, and customs. For example, he believed that what are considered metaphors, myths, and fables at one time may have been the literal truth to people in the past.
What is process philosophy?
Process philosophy was an early 20th century system of thought that was strongly influenced by Albert Einstein's theory of relativity and other scientific ideas, such as the wave theory of light and subatomic physics. The fundamental metaphysical premise of process philosophy is that the basic unit of existence is not a stable thing, such as an atom, but events or change over time. The two most prominent process philosophers were Alfred North Whitehead, 1861 to 1947, and Charles Hartshorne, 1897 to 2000.
How did Mary Estelle's life affect her written work?
Estelle was unmarried and spent much of her adult life in a community of women with similar backgrounds in London. She is famous for having said, "The whole world is a single ladies' family." But she never openly condemned the subordination of women in marriage because she herself believed in charitable service and the unselfish roles of women in family life. Her main objection to the nature of marriage at her time was that men chose wives mainly for material gain or temporary sexual passion. She wanted husbands and wives to have a bond of friendship.
Was Descartes a Cartesian?
Yes, René Descartes was a Cartesian in the sense that he defended his views. But the answer is no, too. In that he did not literally mean that the human mind and the body were two separate things. He famously wrote in Meditation 2 in his Meditations on First Philosophy. 1641 I am not in my body like a pilot in a ship. His intention was to make an abstract distinction between the mind and the body. But because he did not give a satisfactory account of their interaction, Descartes is still stuck with the mind-body dualism of Cartesianism.
Did Boyle's materialism mean he was an atheist?
No, Boyle, 1627 to 1691, was not an atheist. He was a very devout Protestant, and wrote at length about how science and religion could be reconciled. His main publications on this subject were The Christian Virtuoso, 1660, and A Disquisition about the Final Causes of Natural Things, 1688. However, in his disquisition, he argued that, in everyday work, a scientist should only consider the primary qualities of particles. He meant by this that a scientist, unlike everyone else, would not focus on colors, sounds, textures, and smells.
What is truth functional logic?
Truth functional logic preserves logical truth by substituting terms according to the rules of logic. The truth or falsity of a statement can be calculated according to the truth of its parts. For example, if A or not A, the law of non-contradiction, is a rule. Then if A is true, not A must be false, if A is false, then not A must be true. Compound sentences are true or false depending only on whether their components are true or false. For example, the sentence "it is raining and cold" is true if "it is raining" is true and "it is cold" is true. Truth functional logic is typically applied according to tables that indicate the truth values of sentences that contain clauses linked by the connectives if, and, not, if then, and if and only if. The truth or falsity of the whole sentence depends on the truth or falsity of its components. According to the rules of logic that apply to each of the connectives.
Who was Hypatia of Alexandria?
A philosopher and educator who achieved lasting renown, Hypatia of Alexandria in Egypt, c. 350 to 415, became famous throughout intellectual communities for her abilities in Neoplatonist philosophy and mathematics. In the Neoplatonic tradition, Hypatia used mathematics as a path toward understanding the higher world. In Theon, Hypatia's father comments on Ptolemy's Almagest, which set forth the geocentric model of the universe. And he credits her for the work of Book 3. Although Hypatia was a pagan, the Roman Christian Egyptian government appointed her head of a school of Plotinus. Hypatia held that post for about 15 years, teaching both male and female students. She was said to have been very beautiful and was much admired personally. Science Sues, c. 373 c. 414. Her pupil, who was to become Bishop of Tamame, conveyed her views in essays, hymns, and letters. She was the heroine of Charles Kingsley's 1853 novel, Hypatia, or, New Foes with an Old Face. Hypatia was associated with Alexandria's prefect, who was opposed by Saint Cyril of Alexandria. c. 378 to 444, the militant archbishop. As a result of her involvement in that dispute, Hypatia was hacked to pieces with sharp shells and her body burned by a mob of Christian monks. The contemporary feminist philosophy journal, Hypatia, is named after her.
Was Montaigne the only skeptical philosopher to reason in this Pyrrhonic way?
No. Montaigne, 1533 to 1592, derived his views from Sextus Empiricus, 160 to 210 CE. who held that we could not even know whether we had knowledge in certain cases. By 1590, Sextus Empiricus, 150–210, Hypotheses had been published in Latin, Greek, and English. Pyrrhonic skepticism died out by the 3rd century CE. Desiderius Erasmus, 1466–1536, was a closer predecessor to Montaigne, who defended Catholicism based on faith in de libero arbitro. 1524, on the grounds that theological controversies were inconclusive. Martin Luther, 1483–1546, responded to Erasmus with a dogmatic claim about his subjective certainty about God. Based on his own conscience, as well as Scripture.
What has medicine got to do with the history of philosophy?
The theory and practice of medicine is not usually associated with philosophers or the history of philosophy, except for recognition of the ethical aspects of many medical decisions, for example, abortion, end-of-life issues, and cost of care. Medical doctors do not seek out philosophical opinions. And philosophers do not view medicine as part of their normal range of subjects. Nevertheless, until at least the 18th century, medical ideas and practices concerning the human body were closely connected to philosophy in several ways. Since ancient times, beginning with both Plato and Aristotle, philosophers used the kind of knowledge necessary for the practice of medicine as an important example of the nature of practical knowledge, in general. For instance, doctors may agree on the cause and symptoms of a disease. But deciding that a certain patient has the disease and what the appropriate course of treatment for that person should be requires making judgments that go beyond the evidence. Such judgments depend heavily on what was done in similar cases in past experience. And that says something important about the nature of practical knowledge. Aristotle said that because of the importance of the role of experience in medicine, which was not an exact science, it would be wiser to choose an older than a younger doctor. In Aristotle's time there was awareness that medicine had been part of philosophy during the pre-Socratic period. Beginning in the medieval period, especially in Islamic culture, many philosophers had practical training as physicians and were employed as doctors to their patrons. That practice was also common through the Renaissance and early modern period in Europe. Another link between medicine and philosophy is that, as educated thinkers, philosophers have always had ideas about the human body and its functions, which in their scientific aspects have come from the medical views of their times. Philosophers have also maintained an interest in human emotions and thought processes, based on theories developed by psychologists and their predecessors before the science of psychology existed.
What is distinctive about analytical political philosophy?
20th century analytic political philosophers have for the most part supported liberal and egalitarian values. And they have done so in formal writing that is in itself apolitical.
What was Immanuel Kant's proof of God's existence?
Kant rejected the ontological argument on the ground that existence is not a quality or characteristic of things. According to Kant, we cannot say that the sweater is red, wool, and it exists. He rejected the first cause argument as partly relying on the ontological argument. And he rejected the argument from design on the grounds that, at best, it proves only an architect or designer of the universe, and not a creator. Kant himself thought there was a moral proof for God's existence because the moral agent knows that he cannot achieve his goals on his own without God. The resulting belief in God becomes a matter of individual personal conviction. Not it is morally certain that there is a God, but I am morally certain that there is a God.
What is sense knowledge?
Sense knowledge is information gathered through our senses, such as sight, touch, hearing, and so forth.
What was John Searle's Chinese room argument?
In his The Rediscovery of the Mind, 1992. Searle supposed that a person who understands no Chinese is locked in a room with Chinese symbols and an algorithm or computer program that can be used to automatically answer questions in Chinese. The answers are good enough to be indistinguishable from answers by a Chinese speaker. Searle insists that what is missing from this picture, which is the overall computational theory of the mind in contemporary philosophy, is understanding the person in the room does not understand Chinese. Adherence to a computational theory of mind, in response to Searle's position, would probably claim that unless we go back to a mysterious ghost in the machine, the behavior of the person locked in the room is exactly what is meant by understanding Chinese. As to who is right in this argument, no one knows for sure. As Jerry Fodor, 1935, noted, we, meaning philosophers of mind, do not yet have an adequate theory of mind. If you think you do, then try explaining exactly how your desire to raise your right arm results in that arm going up.
What was David Hume's great ambition in philosophy?
Hume sought to create a science of the mind, using empiricist methods in the same way that Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, had created a science of the physical world.
Who was Claude Lévi-Strauss?
Claude Lévi-Strauss, 1908, is a French social anthropologist who is best known for The Elementary Structures of Kinship, 1949, and The Savage Mind, 1962. He applied Saussurian ideas of the system of language to social structures, analyzing human relations and systems of exchange, particularly in kinship relations.
What is anarchism?
Anarchism is the political doctrine that human happiness and well-being are best served without powerful political structures. Anarchists seek the decentralization of power, into small units, controlled by the people.
What are primary qualities and secondary qualities?
The scientific distinction between primary and secondary qualities was to prove very important for subsequent philosophy. Primary qualities are size, shape, mass, motion, and quantity. Secondary qualities were color, texture, sound, and smell. It was believed that the primary qualities of atoms resulted in the secondary qualities that could be sensed by us in objects made up of atoms. That is, the world of our perception is made up of secondary qualities, which are formed by interactions between the atoms in objects and the atoms in our sense organs. Secondary qualities are exactly those qualities of sense such as color, sound, texture, and smell that make up our everyday experience. But the real world was made up of atoms.
Why was the idea of a manifest image important?
Whose analytic 20th century philosophers who explicated a manifest image of the world sought to reconcile the common view of the world with the scientific view. The term was coined by Wilfrid Sellars, 1912 to 1989.
Who were the main social Darwinists?
William Graham Sumner, 1840 to 1910, professor at Yale, was the American version of the English evolutionist Herbert Spencer, 1820 to 1903. Sumner was a strong advocate of unrestricted capitalism. He was famous for his essay The Man of Virtue, which promoted self-interest as a primary duty for individuals. The industrialist Andrew Carnegie, 1835 to 1919, built on these ideas in his The Gospel of Wealth, which further enshrined the law of competition as a natural principle of progress.
Was Newton an eccentric personality?
According to historical anecdotes and gossip, the answer would have to be yes. There is evidence that Newton, 1642 to 1727, was eccentric and did not interact well with authors. His main quirk was his secretiveness about his work. He did not even communicate the success of his early research to others until 1669. To this day, it is not clear when he did what or which recorded intuitions correspond to what publications. After he got the position of Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge, except for 3 or 4 weeks a year. He spent 26 years in Cambridge, lecturing on optics and elementary mathematics. That is, his life was somewhat sheltered. Part of the reason Newton hated to publish was that he did not like the controversy that was always likely to follow. When in 1684 the Royal Society appointed a committee, led by Edmund Halley, 1656 to 1742, to remind Newton of his commitment to publish Principia Mathematica. Halley had to persuade him to include the third book, which contained the application of his system. Newton at first wanted to suppress that work because he had heard that Robert Hooke, 1635 to 1703, claimed to have had the same system before him. Indeed, when Newton had related his discoveries about the decomposition of light, or what the components of light are, to the Royal Society in 1672, Robert Hooke and others disagreed with part of how he explained his findings. Newton refused to discuss the matter or publish his work until after Hooke died. The Principia manuscript was finally delivered by a Dr. Vincent, husband of Miss Story, at whose house Newton had lodged in his teens. Apparently she had been the sole romantic interest in his entire life. Biographers relate that Newton had a psychological breakdown from 1692 to 1693. Following unsuccessful attempts to get a prestigious and lucrative government position through the efforts of his friend Charles Halifax, Newton wrote to Samuel Pepys, 1633 to 1703, that he was extremely troubled at the embroilment he was in and that he would have to withdraw from Pepys and his other friends. He then wrote to John Locke, 1632 to 1704, apologizing for being of the opinion that you endeavored to embroil me with women. Locke was kind and reassuring, and Newton apologized further, claiming overwork and lack of sleep. Apparently, there had been no basis in fact for Newton's belief in having been embroiled. Newton did have an embroiled dispute over whether he or Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, had first invented the theory of flux ions or the differential calculus. Through his office as president of the Royal Society, Newton exerted influence over the investigation of the matter, which was finally resolved to credit him with the discovery. Although it misrepresented the time sequence of correspondence on the subject between Newton and Leibniz, Newton did no further scientific work after his position as Warden of the Mint. He referred to natural philosophy as a litigious lady and mentioned another pull at the moon. He was apparently preoccupied with occult readings of biblical prophecy and alchemical theories. Although the nature of these endeavors is still unclear because he often wrote in code. Some contemporary scholars now think that these occult studies were Newton's main interest and that the greatness of his scientific achievements was largely the result of hype, after the fact. Newton's reluctance to publish or even continue his studies after he became warden of the mint might be less a matter of psychological instability than is often assumed.
What can now be said about the dispute between Thomas Reid and the empiricists?
In terms of the process of knowledge, as a matter of physiological psychology concerning what goes on in the brain, there may well be ideas or representations in the brain, as the empiricists maintained. However, in the mind, our direct experience seems not to be of our ideas or sensations but of the objects we sense themselves, as Reid pointed out.
Why have existentialist philosophers claimed Dostoevsky as one of their own?
The great Russian novelist Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, 1821–1881, is considered an inspiration to the modern philosophical tradition of existentialism because of the depth of his appreciation for the difficulty of the human condition and the universal problems he and his fictional characters agonized over. Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844–1900, said that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist from whom I have something to learn. He praised Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, 1864, for having cried truth from the blood. Indeed, in Notes from the Underground Dostoevsky introduces a self-deprecating narrator who became an iconic anti-hero for subsequent existentialist writers. The narrator's first words are, "I am a sick man," and his ensuing reflections, rantings, and ruminations make it clear that the sickness at issue is primarily a malaise of the soul. Not the least of the sickness is a disgust with reason. Although Dostoevsky is well known for valorizing simplicity in religious faith, he did not arrive at that viewpoint easily, either in works of fiction such as Crime and Punishment, 1866, or in his own life. In his masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, 1881, Ivan is an atheist, while his brother, Alyosha, is studying to become a monk. In the famous Grand Inquisitor dialogue within this novel, Ivan presses Alyosha on his faith, going to the heart of the matter in asking how a good God can permit the suffering of innocent children. Ivan recounts the story of a peasant's child whom the Lord allows his dogs to tear apart, because the child threw a stone at one of them. The character of Alyosha is said to be modeled on Dostoevsky's close friend, the Russian philosopher Vladimir Sergeyevich Solovyov, 1853–1900. who longed to reunite the Roman Catholic and Russian Orthodox churches.
Why has Noam Chomsky's theory of language been so influential?
Chomsky's principle of a universal grammar is compatible with materialism. It entails that the mind can be scientifically studied like a natural phenomenon. Moreover, the output of speakers can be used as data from which to infer deeper linguistic structures than those evident in spoken language. Insofar as language is an important, if not primary, mental activity, the idea of innate physical structures determining language production has implications for understanding other mental functions. Chomsky's work in linguistics has had a strong influence on the philosopher of mind Jerry Fodor, 1935, for example.
What was Marsilio Ficino's contribution to the spirit of the Renaissance?
Marsilio Ficino, 1433–1499, was ordained a priest in 1473. And from the center of cultural life in Florence he attempted to draw people to Christ through Platonism. Although he was the first to translate Plato's dialogues into Latin, he was not a purist. He also provided translations of Plotinus, 205–270, and other Neoplatonists. Ficino believed that Plato got his ideas from a legendary Egyptian magician, Hermes Trismegistus, whose work he also translated. Ficino claimed a form of wisdom that combines religion and philosophy. His own 3 books on life suggested the idea of a world soul that was connected to the world's body by occult means. In human beings, a similar relationship holds insofar as the astral body connects body and soul. This parallel structure of the world and human beings is what makes spiritual advancement, as well as the attainment of worldly goods, possible through the practice of magic. Ficino's worldview and spiritual beliefs were so clearly opposed to Aristotelian Christianity as well as probably being heretical that their very circula signaled important cultural changes, if not the demise of orthodoxy.
Did Thomas Reid have his own ideas, in addition to saying why the empiricists were wrong?
Yes, and Reid was highly influential for a while. Although he is often overlooked as an Enlightenment philosopher, he lectured at King's College, Aberdeen, and held the chair of moral philosophy at Glasgow. His main publications were an inquiry into the human mind on the principles of common sense, 1764. Essays on the intellectual powers of man, 1785, and Essays on the active powers of man, 1788. After rejecting the empiricist representative theory of knowledge, Reid developed an intuitionist theory of knowledge in terms of mental faculties. Reid thought that we have innate powers of conception and conviction. There are first principles that we can identify by their early appearance. Universality, and irresistibility. We could not deny an irresistible principle. For instance, sensations are operations of the mind that, together with impressions made on our sense organs, cause our conceptions of primary and secondary qualities. A sensation of smell thus suggests that there is a quality in the object causing the sensation. In analyzing vision, Reid reasoned that the data are received on the round surface of the eye, but processed within it. He concluded that visual space must have a non-Euclidean geometry of curved space. He was about a century ahead of his time in postulating non-Euclidean geometry. In addition to faculties of perception and memory, Reid posited a moral faculty resulting in conceptions of justice or injustice that may differ, depending on different people's conceptions of the same action. He also posited active powers, leading to action, according to principles of action. When Reid spoke of powers in this way, he seemed to mean capabilities in the mind. The principles of action were animal principles, such as appetites and physical desires, and rational principles that include understanding and will.
What is logical positivism?
A new generation of thinkers who were influenced by Bertrand Russell (1872–1970) and Ludwig Wittgenstein (1889–1951), created a 20th-century version of Auguste Comte's 1798–1857, 19th-century intellectual endorsement of science. The term logical positivism was coined in 1930 by two supporters, E. Keila and A. Petzal, philosophers who were part of the early movement that logical positivism came to represent. The 20th-century positivists Moritz Schlick, 1882–1936, Rudolf Carnap, 1891–1970, Otto Neurath, 1882–1945, and in England, A. J. Ayer, 1910–1989, were members of what became known as the Vienna Circle.
What did Aquinas think about the soul?
Although Thomas Aquinas, 1224–1274, carefully and meticulously investigated what was known in general about human senses, intellect, will, and emotions, he believed that the human being is the whole of all these faculties or powers. Simply put, the physical body is the matter or material of a human being, and its form or soul is its substantial form. That the soul can understand general truths and exercise free will proves its non-materiality. The reality of the soul is its spirituality. Because the soul cannot be divided, it cannot be corrupted and is therefore immortal. Furthermore, because the soul cannot be divided. It cannot be the result of biological inheritance but is made directly by God, each time a person is born. This divine intervention at birth gives the biological process of human reproduction a dignity and sanctity that elevates the institution of marriage.
What is pragmatism?
Pragmatism is a distinctively American philosophy that originated in community discussion groups and came to define the philosophy department at Harvard University during the late 19th century. While not as scientific in perspective as some philosophy in Europe during the same time, it represented an effort to think in a practical way.
When did philosophy begin?
In the West, the scientific aspect of philosophy, or abstract general thought about the natural and human worlds, began in ancient Greece in the 7th century B.C., with inquiry about the earth and the cosmos by the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers, many of whom continued to flourish in Socrates' time. Between the pre-Socratics and Socrates, the sophists were the first to focus on the human world. Although their methods were adversarial and perhaps unethical, they were paid for their arguments. Without concern about their truth or the justice of what they were arguing for. With Socrates' activities in the 5th century BCE, and his student Plato's dramatization of Socrates' style of discourse in written dialogues in the 4th century BCE, the true humanistic side of philosophy was founded. The two big subjects of the natural world and the human world endured as the concerns of philosophers. Well after the physical and social sciences branched out on their own. These subjects are also perennial in ordinary life.
How was Johann Gottlieb Fichte's idealism connected to freedom?
Fichte thought that our spontaneity is something we can become aware of through reflection on ourselves as active beings, who think, as well as do things in the world. This entails that the ultimate reality is a transcendental ego, a locus of pure activity. Following Kant, Fichte meant that behind the self of which a person is aware while thinking, there is an unperceived self. Fichte believed that maturity was required to realize this freedom of the self. Those who were immature would cling to dogmatism.
What are the roots of St. Anselm's ontological argument?
First, St. Anselm's, 1033–1109, argument for God's existence seems to depend on pure reason as means to truth. which goes back to the ancient Greeks. That it only depends on reason, without observation or experience. Perhaps makes it closer to Plato, or the Neoplatonists, than to Aristotle. Second, the argument relies on the ancient assumption that being or having more being is better or more perfect than non-being or having less being.
Why was Pyrrho important?
His refusal to make judgments was an important school of skepticism that was developed after the Renaissance and during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Known as Pyrrhonic skepticism. It was the general philosophical approach that many things in human life cannot be known.
What are the Pyrrhonic tropes?
They were what the skeptics took to be typical subjects of knowledge about which people disagreed.
What was René Descartes like as a person?
It is difficult to say. In contemporary terms, Descartes would probably be considered a fearful, anxious, and self-absorbed man with social disorders. He was the only 17th-century philosopher who never had a patron or a secure post. And he was not independently wealthy. Descartes moved to Holland to escape the distractions of Paris, so that he could concentrate on his work. He was secretive about his personal life and moved his household about once a year during a 20-year period. Wherever he was, he conducted experiments, sometimes getting animal organs from local butchers. One account has it that when he studied vision, he literally looked through a calf's eyes. Descartes was greatly interested in special foods and diets. Possibly as a way to prolong life or even to achieve immortality. At times he was a vegetarian. It's clear this was not for moral reasons. Given his belief that animals are machines, and other times he thought that the secret lay in eggs. With a servant named Helena Jans, he had an illegitimate daughter. While Descartes' daughter, Francine, is usually described as illegitimate by biographers. Her baptism was recorded in 1635 in the Reformed Church in Deventer. Francine died at the age of 5 from scarlet fever, and Descartes expressed great sorrow for this loss. Descartes' motto was said to have been, "A life well hidden is a life well lived." Another version has it as, "I advance masked."